The darkened cargo bay of the interstellar transport hummed softly, filled with the cold hum of machinery. Nara, an alien girl with iridescent skin that shimmered like starlight, sat quietly among the shadows. She tugged lightly at the metallic cuffs on her wrists, evidence of her captivity. The ship hurtled through hyperspace, bound for an unfamiliar destination, Earth. Sold by her own people to settle a political debt, she was offered as a slave to a human named Dax, a man whose name she knew only from whispered rumors. Nara's people, the Lumerians, were known for their intricate culture and biotechnology, but a peace treaty between the two civilizations demanded an unsettling sacrifice. A slave for peace, they said. When the doors hissed open, she was led into the glaring sunlight of Earth's surface, her delicate senses overwhelmed by the starkness of it all. Standing before her was Dax, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a rough appearance, his expression unreadable. She expected cruelty, but what she found instead was indifference, perhaps even something gentler hidden beneath his stoic gaze. With a subtle gesture, he motioned for her to follow, leaving the intergalactic merchants behind. Her journey into the unknown had begun. Nara followed Dax silently, her bare feet barely making a sound on the cool concrete floor of the landing platform. Her mind raced as she struggled to make sense of her new reality. Was this man a soldier? A merchant? The rumors about humans were contradictory. Some portrayed them as ruthless conquerors, while others whispered tales of kindness and loyalty. Dax, however, remained an enigma, neither cruel nor kind, simply unreadable. He led her to a modest dwelling on the outskirts of a human colony. It was not the cold, clinical prison she had imagined, but a warm, lived-in home. The air smelled of earth and wood, and tiny machines, primitive compared to Lemurian standards, buzzed and whirred quietly in the corners. Dax opened the door, glancing over his shoulder once, as if to ensure she followed. Nara hesitated before stepping inside, her alien senses drinking in the foreign surroundings. The interior was simple, functional but not harsh. Low bed sat in one corner, and a wooden table bore evidence of half-finished meals and scattered tools. Dax motioned toward the table. "Sit," he said in a voice that was more tired than harsh. Nara hesitated but complied. She perched on the edge of the chair, her posture rigid, hands folded in her lap to conceal the trembling in her fingers. Dax sat across from her, rubbing his temples as though the weight of the world sat on his shoulders. "I didn't ask for this," he said finally, his voice low and gruff. "They gave me a slave because they thought it would fix things between our people. But I don't want a slave. I want this nonsense to be over." His words carried no malice, only exhaustion. Nora met his gaze cautiously, unsure how to respond. She had expected orders, commands, anything but this strange confession. I don't know what you want from me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Dax leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. "I don't want anything. Just stay out of trouble." The simplicity of his request left Nora feeling more confused than ever. Her entire life had been upended, her freedom stripped away, and now she was faced with a man who neither mistreated her nor seemed to care about her presence at all. For the next few days, they existed in uneasy silence. Dax provided her with clothing, plain but comfortable, and simple tasks to keep her occupied. Nora found herself sweeping the floor, tending to the small garden outside, and learning to navigate human customs with cautious curiosity. Dax rarely spoke, and when he did, it was with a detached politeness that left her feeling like a visitor rather than a prisoner. Yet, as time passed, Nara began to notice small things. The way Dax left extra blankets folded at the edge of her bed. How he always ensured there was enough food for both of them, even when supplies ran low. And the way his gaze softened slightly when he thought she wasn't looking. Despite herself, Nara felt the smallest flicker of warmth bloom within her chest. Feeling she hadn't expected in a place she thought would only bring despair. But just as she began to think she could find some semblance of peace, the past came crashing back in ways she hadn't anticipated. The peace Nara had begun to cultivate was short-lived. One evening, as she stood in the garden with the fading sunlight painting the sky, she noticed Dax standing by the comms console inside. His voice was low, nearly inaudible, but the tension in his posture told her everything she needed to know. Trouble was brewing. She moved closer, just out of sight, her sensitive ears picking up fragments of his conversation. "I didn't agree to this," Dax growled into the communicator. "She's not some commodity. I don't care what the council says." A voice crackled through the receiver, sharp, commanding, and dismissive. "You don't have a choice, Dax. They gave her to you for a reason. Whether you like it or not, she's now your responsibility." Nara stepped back, her pulse quickening. It wasn't just a matter of keeping her as a slave. There were larger forces at play, and Dax seemed caught in the middle of a political game far beyond either of them. Later that night, when Dax returned from his conversation, he found Nara sitting at the table, her hands folded neatly on her lap. She met his gaze with a steady resolve she hadn't felt before. "Why did they send me here?" she asked softly. "What do they want from us?" Dax sighed and ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "They think if we bond, it'll solidify the peace between our people. A symbolic gesture or some nonsense like that." He shook his head in frustration. "They expect us to play along, like we're pieces on a board." The weight of his words settled heavily between them. It was clear now. Nara was not just a slave, but a pawn in a larger, more dangerous game. "I don't want to be anyone's symbol," Nara murmured, her voice steady, but filled with quiet defiance. Dax's gaze softened, and for the first time, Nara saw a flicker of something unfamiliar, understanding. "Neither do I," he admitted. From that moment, unspoken alliance formed between them. Though Dax remained gruff and distant, there was a shift in how he treated her, not as a burden, but as an equal. He began teaching her more about Earth and its ways. He showed her how to read maps, tend to wounds, and even use basic tools, things she never expected to learn in captivity. Nara, in turn, shared fragments of her own culture. She told Dax about the Lumerians' biotechnological advancements, their festivals of light, and their deep connection with the stars. Slowly but surely, the walls between them began to crumble, replaced by something that neither of them had anticipated. A fragile but growing bond. As the days bled into weeks, Nara found herself laughing more often, her heart lighter than it had been in a long time. Dax, too, seemed less burdened by the world, his rare smiles becoming a small but cherished gift. But just as they began to find solace in each other's company, a message arrived that shattered their newfound peace. Dax stood in the doorway, holding a small communication device, his face pale. "They're coming," he said, his voice hollow. "The council wants to inspect our progress." Nara's heart sank. The fragile world they had built together was on the verge of collapse. If the council found that their relationship was anything less than perfect, the consequences could be catastrophic for both of them. And in the depths of her heart, Nara knew that her journey was far from over. The hardest part was still to come. The days leading to the council's inspection passed in uneasy silence. Both Nara and Dax knew that any misstep could bring ruin upon them. The council was infamous for being unforgiving, especially toward those who failed to meet their expectations. They had sent Nara not just as a peace offering, but as a test, one that Dax had never agreed to take. Nara sat on the porch of Dax's home, the cool evening air brushing against her skin. She could feel the tension rolling off Dax as he paced inside, muttering to himself. His frustration was palpable, but beneath it, there was fear of what might happen if the council deemed their bond a failure. The rules were clear. If Dax and Nara didn't demonstrate unity, the treaty would fall apart, and the consequences would be severe for both their worlds. "I won't let them control us," Dax muttered, Stepping outside, he sat beside Nora, the rough wood of the porch creaking under his weight. "They expect us to pretend," she whispered, "but I'm not good at pretending." Dax gave her a sidelong glance, his lips curving slightly, though the smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Neither am I." A quiet moment stretched between them, the weight of the situation heavy on their minds. Yet there was comfort in their shared defiance, an unspoken promise that they would face whatever came together, no matter the cost. That night, Dax decided they needed a plan. They would have to convince the council that their relationship was more than just a political farce. It wasn't enough to merely get along. They needed to make it look genuine, convincing enough to fool even the sharpest of minds. "We'll practice," Dax said, his tone resolute. "We'll figure out how to act like we care." Nora raised an eyebrow, the hint of a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Act, huh?" Dax grunted, already regretting his choice of words. "You know what I mean." Over the next few days, they rehearsed, awkwardly at first, their interactions stilted and unnatural. Dax tried to teach Nora how to appear relaxed and affectionate, but every attempt ended in awkward silences and muffled laughter. Nora, for her part, did her best to follow his lead, though the entire charade felt absurd. "You're terrible at this," Nora teased after one particularly clumsy attempt at casual conversation. Dax shot her a mock glare. "So are you." Despite the absurdity of it all, something strange began to happen. The more they practiced, the more natural their interactions became. Laughter came more easily, touches grew less hesitant, and soon, they found themselves sharing moments that felt real, more real than either of them had expected. Late one evening, as they sat together beneath the stars, Dax glanced at Nora, his expression uncharacteristically soft. "I don't know how this happened," he murmured, "but I'm glad you're here." Nora's heart skipped a beat. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made her chest ache. She looked at Dax, seeing not just a human but someone who had become important to her. "I'm glad too," she whispered. The bond between them, once a reluctant alliance, was slowly transforming into something neither of them had planned for, something real. But just as hope began to blossom, the day of the inspection arrived. The council's ship descended from the sky like a looming predator, its sleek hull reflecting the sunlight. Nora stood beside Dax at the edge of the landing platform, her heart pounding in her chest. The time had come to put everything they had practiced into action, and to see if their fragile bond would be enough to deceive the council. As the ship's doors opened, and the council members stepped out, Nora took a deep breath, her hand brushing against Dax's arm. It was a small gesture, but one filled with meaning. Dax glanced down at her, a flicker of reassurance in his eyes. Together, they stepped forward to meet the council. The council members stepped off their ship, their faces hidden behind silver masks. Their presence cast a cold shadow over the quiet homestead, and Nora felt her stomach twist with unease. Dax's hand rested lightly on her back, a subtle but grounding gesture, reassuring, even in the face of impending judgment. Leading the group was Elder Terran, a sharp-eyed figure known for his rigid adherence to protocol. His calculating gaze flickered between Nora and Dax, as if weighing every detail of their presence together. "So, this is the pair we've heard so much about," Terran said, his voice smooth and impassive. He gave no indication of approval or disapproval, only a vague sense of expectation. "We are here to assess your progress." Dax nodded, his expression carefully neutral. "We've been working on it." Nora fought the urge to laugh at the understatement. Working on it, indeed. The council wasted no time, launching into their evaluation with clinical efficiency. They asked questions, pointed, probing questions meant to reveal any cracks in the facade. "How do you communicate with each other?" asked one counselor, her tone laced with subtle skepticism. "We talk," Nora replied smoothly. "We listen. We figure things out." Another council member leaned forward. And what have you learned about each other? Dax exchanged a quick glance with Nora, and for a moment, the practice answers they had rehearsed seemed irrelevant. This was the moment that mattered, the one where they had to convince the council not just with words, but with the truth beneath them. I have learned she's a lot tougher than she looks, Dax said, his voice quiet but sincere. And smarter. Nora felt a flush rise to her cheeks at the unexpected compliment. And I've learned that Dax cares more than he lets on, she added, glancing at him with a soft smile. Even if he's terrible at showing it. A flicker of something, approval perhaps, passed through Elder Terran's gaze, but it was gone before Nora could be sure. The questions continued, delving deeper into the nature of their bond. As the interrogation dragged on, Nora found herself growing more confident. Every answer she gave felt less like an act, and more like a glimpse into something real, something she hadn't expected to find in the strangest of circumstances. But just as she began to think they might survive the inspection unscathed, one of the counselors leaned forward, his gaze cold and piercing. Do you care for each other? He asked bluntly. Truly? The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Nora's breath hitched in her throat. This was the test, the moment that would determine everything. Dax met her gaze, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to fall away. There was no council, no treaty, no expectations, just the two of them, standing at the edge of something neither of them had planned for. Yes, Dax said, his voice steady and certain. We do. Nora felt her heart swell with an unexpected warmth, and she nodded. We do. Elder Terran studied them in silence, as if searching for any hint of deception, but the truth was undeniable, written plainly in their eyes. After what felt like an eternity, Terran gave a slight nod. Very well, he said, turning to the other counselors. We have seen enough. Without another word, the counselors gathered their things and returned to their ship. The air seemed to lighten as the vessel lifted off, leaving Dax and Nora standing alone on the landing platform, the weight of the inspection finally lifting from their shoulders. Nora let out a shaky breath, and Dax gave her a rare lopsided grin. Well, he said, I think we pulled it off. Nora smiled back, a sense of relief washing over her. But deep down, she knew that what they had shared in those moments wasn't just for show. It was real, and it was only the beginning. With the council gone, a strange silence fell over Dax's homestead. The inspection was over, and the weight of expectation that had loomed over them had lifted, but the absence of that pressure left something unfamiliar in its place. Possibility. Neither Dax nor Nora knew exactly what the future held, but for the first time since her arrival, the path ahead felt open, free from fear. The next few days passed in a blur of quiet routines and small, unexpected moments. Dax was still the same man, gruff, practical, and occasionally awkward, but there was a new softness to his demeanor, a sense of ease that hadn't been there before. Nora noticed how he lingered in conversations, how his eyes held hers a little longer, and how his rare smiles came more easily now. She, too, found herself changing. The wariness that had clung to her since her arrival began to fade, replaced by curiosity and something even more surprising. Hope, the house, once a place of confinement, began to feel like a home. And Dax, once a stranger, began to feel like someone she could trust. One evening, as they sat on the porch beneath the stars, Nora glanced at Dax, her heart full of unspoken thoughts. Thank you, she said softly. Dax raised an eyebrow. For what? For everything, she replied, struggling to find the right words. For treating me like a person, not just a symbol. Dax shrugged, though his expression was far from indifferent. You're not just a symbol, Nora. You never were. The words, simple as they were, made Nora's chest ache with emotion. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear them, how much she had needed someone to see her for who she was, not what she represented. As the days turned into weeks, their bond deepened in ways neither of them could have predicted. They shared stories, Nara's tales of the luminous cities of Lemuria, Dax's memories of Earth's rugged landscapes. They laughed over small things, argued over silly misunderstandings, and found comfort in each other's company on quiet nights. It was not a perfect relationship, far from it. Dax's stubbornness often clashed with Nora's curiosity, and Nora's unfamiliarity with human customs sometimes left Dax exasperated. But the imperfections only made their connection feel more real, more meaningful. And with each passing day, the lines between obligation and affection blurred, until it became impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. But just as they began to believe that they had found a new normal, a message arrived, one that threatened to shatter everything they had built. Dax found it early one morning, his expression dark as he read the encrypted transmission. When Nara saw the look on his face, her heart sank. "What is it?" she asked quietly. Dax hesitated for a moment before handing her the device. The message was brief, but its meaning was clear. The Council was calling her back. The peace treaty was secure, and her service was no longer required. Nara stared at the words, her mind reeling. After everything they had been through, the Council expected her to return as if nothing had changed, as if the bond she and Dax had forged was just another transaction, easily dismissed. "I won't let them take you," Dax said firmly, his voice low and steady. Nara looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. What if I don't want to go?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. In that moment, Nara knew that the life she had built here, however unexpected, was the one she wanted. And Dax, with all his flaws and stubbornness, was the person she wanted to share it with. But staying wouldn't be easy. Defying the Council could bring consequences neither of them could foresee. Yet as Dax took her hand in his, Nara knew one thing for certain. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The morning light cast soft shadows across the room as Nara and Dax sat together, the weight of the Council's message pressing down on them. They both knew the decision they faced wasn't just about where Nara would live. It was about reclaiming their freedom and defying the forces that sought to control them. "They won't let me stay without a fight," Nara whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "If I refuse to return, they'll come for me." Dax's jaw tightened, his eyes burning with a fierce determination. Let them come. Nara knew the risk. Defying the Council would mean severing ties with both of their worlds, turning them into fugitives. But as she looked at Dax, she realized something important. He was worth the risk. A life lived in fear and control wasn't a life worth living. And for the first time in her life, Nara felt what it was like to choose her own path. "We leave tonight," Dax said, his voice resolute, "before they know we've made our choice." The plan was dangerous but simple. They would leave the homestead under the cover of darkness and disappear into the vast wilderness beyond the colony. From there, they would find a way off-world, far from the Council's reach. As night fell, they packed their things, few belongings but enough to survive. Dax handed Nara a small device. "In case we get separated," he said gruffly. His touch lingered on hers for a moment longer than necessary, a silent promise that they would find each other no matter what. When the sky darkened, they slipped out of the house and into the forest, the shadows wrapping around them like a protective cloak. The air was cool, and the scent of pine lingered on the breeze. Nara's heart pounded in her chest, but it wasn't just fear she felt, it was exhilaration. For the first time in her life, she was running toward something instead of away from it. They moved quickly, Dax leading the way through the dense undergrowth. Hours passed in silence, the only sounds their footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. Just as they began to believe they might make it, a low hum filled the air. A sound Nara recognized all too well. "Their ships," she whispered, her pulse quickening. Dax grabbed her hand and pulled her into the shelter of a rock formation. They crouched together, watching as a sleek council ship hovered overhead, its searchlights sweeping the forest floor. Nara's breath hitched, fear clawing at her throat. If they were caught now, there would be no escape. "We have to keep moving," Dax murmured, his hand gripping hers tightly. "Stay close." They darted through the forest, staying low to avoid the searchlights. The ship circled above, relentless in its pursuit, just as they thought they had evaded it. The ground beneath their feet trembled. A second ship landing nearby. Dax cursed under his breath. "They're cutting us off." Nara's mind raced. They couldn't outrun the ships. Not like this. But maybe they didn't have to. She reached for Dax's arm, her eyes burning with determination. "We need to fight." Dax hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Then we fight." The council's guards emerged from the trees, their sleek armor glinting in the moonlight. Nora and Dax moved as one, their bond forged in fire and strengthened by every challenge they had faced together. Nora fought with the agility of her people, her movements graceful and precise. Dax fought with brute strength, his blows powerful and unrelenting. They fought not just for their freedom, but for the life they had chosen, together. The battle was fierce, but they fought with a desperation born of love and defiance. And when the last of the guards lay unconscious on the forest floor, they knew they had won. Not just the fight, but their future. Breathless and exhausted, Nara turned to Dax, her heart pounding in her chest. "We did it," she whispered, disbelief and relief washing over her. Dax grinned, pulling her into his arms. "We did." As they stood together beneath the stars, the hum of the council's ships fading into the distance, Nara knew that their journey was far from over. There would be more challenges, more battles to fight, but they would face them together, side by side, heart to heart. And no matter what lay ahead, Nara knew one thing for certain. She was no longer a slave to anyone's expectations. She was free, and in Dax's arms she had found something even more precious than freedom. She had found love. Their story was just beginning.